Check Podcasts.
Welcome to the Rising Economy Podcast, where leading thinkers, changemakers, and newsmakers discuss current issues and bold ideas impacting the economy and people of Greater Victoria.
Welcome to the all-new Rising Economy podcast, brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership. I'm Carrie Slavens, host of Rising Economy, and before we get into this episode, why the arts and culture sector is vital to a thriving economy, I want to acknowledge that we are podcasting today from the Czech studios located on the territories of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. From theaters and museums to writers' festivals and public arts installations, arts and culture isn't just a nice to have, it's a potent economic engine. One example is Bilbao, Spain, where the Guggenheim Museum's arrival transformed the city's industrial image into a cultural hotspot, significantly increasing tourism and economic vitality. Then there's places like Nashville, known for its music scene, or Stratford, Ontario, known for its theater scene. And they all demonstrate how arts and culture can boost economic prosperity. To talk about this today, I'm excited to have two guests, Franz Lehrbass and Dallas Gislason here. Franz Lehrbass is Executive Director of the Royal and McPherson Theatre Society, which manages our Royal Theatre and the McPherson Playhouse, providing, I think, about services to about 200,000 patrons annually, setting the stage for an exceptional customer experience from ticket purchase through to the closing curtain. Franz came to this position in 2020 following 10 years as General Manager of the Western Manitoba Centennial Auditorium in Brandon, Manitoba. He was also a radio producer for CBC Radio Music in Toronto. My colleague, Dallas Gislason, is Executive Director of Community Economies for South Island Prosperity Partnership, Greater Victoria's economic development agency. Dallas has played an instrumental role in many industry-leading economic development projects in Canada, the U.S., and overseas in the past 15 years. It was actually Dallas's Economic Lens column on DouglasMagazine.com that sparked the idea for this podcast. So welcome.
Yeah,
good to have you both here, and it's a great topic to talk about, a nice, colorful topic. So, Dallas, let's start with you. When I read your Economic Lens column published last week on DouglasMagazine.com, I was surprised to learn that arts and culture contribute much more to the Greater Victoria regional economy than most people realize, even more than the cruise industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's really, the reason why I wrote the article on the economic the economic contribution of the arts was really to surprise people, because I don't think people would realize just how important the arts are to the economy. But I do want to start by saying that I think the contribution of arts to our society is much, much, much more than about the economic contribution. But the exciting thing is that the economic contribution actually helps us build a bit of a case when we're taking the call to action, which we'll talk about in a bit on this podcast. But the call to action, the economic impact of the arts actually helps us, make the case, or like in our own minds, but also to government, for grant programs and all these reasons. There's this economic benefit that's huge. And so the data that I cited in the article was from 2019, and it was generated using StatsCan data. But the impact, or the contribution toward GDP of arts and culture in our region is $788 million per year, and over 10,000 jobs supported by the sector. And so the comparison I made was just to the cruise industry, just to give people a feel, because you drive to the cruise terminal and you see these giant floating hotels, which contribute about $300 million annually to the economy. And so the arts is nearly three times that.
Right. So the arts and culture sector, it's ubiquitous. We see it, we hear it, we feel it. Yet it kind of runs, it's a bit of an undercurrent when it comes to economic acknowledgement for its contributions. So I think you're making a really super point. Somebody who's at the heart of it is Franz. And Franz, your work at the Royal McPherson Theatre Society puts you at the heartbeat of performing arts and culture in Greater Victoria. RMTS hosts performances, I know, from local organizations like the Victoria Symphony and Pacific Opera, to traveling shows like Come From Away, which was hugely popular. So what's your take on our arts and culture sector in Greater Victoria and its significance to the economy?
Well, the population of the entire CRD is less than the population of London, Ontario, but it's an affluent population and people have money to spend on their passions. So arts and entertainment from touring acts and established local presenters can really punch above their weight. There's lots of positive economic spin-off from all of this activity. And we have the infrastructure to support that kind of activity. We have a 1,400-seat professional theatre in the Royal Theatre. We have a 770 seat theatre in the McPherson Playhouse, and so for that kind of activity, we're well set up. But professional infrastructure comes at a cost, and I'm sure we'll get into that a bit later.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about what's missing.
And I just want to say, I think that all of our arts and culture organizations deserve a big round of applause because you came through COVID. No easy task. I mean, you couldn't have live audiences. You had to adapt. What was that like for you, and where are you now?
It was pretty brutal for us. So COVID shut down the theaters about 7 weeks after I started the job. So I thought I was going to be managing 2 vibrant theaters, and then I wasn't. And so, basically 2 years of crisis management. We prevailed, and so we're back. We have lots of shows, lots of activity. People are gainfully employed in the theaters again. The hangover for us is inflation, the rising costs of everything, and our funding has been flat dollar amounts for 25 years. We're working with the CRD and the municipalities to hopefully change those bylaws, but it's a bit of a crush, so that's part of our ongoing challenge. But it's great to have shows again, and earned revenue is 90% of our operating budget, so that's positive.
Great. So, I mean, obviously it sounds like you don't automatically get a cost of living increase or cost of inflation increase every year for the performing arts, and that's something to really struggle with. Well, Dallas, actually you mentioned in your economic lens column, you say a vibrant art scene is key to our creative economy, but you add the caveat, only if we nurture it. So it's a great segue, Franz. I want to ask you both, are we as a region, as individual municipalities, and as a population doing enough to nurture our arts and culture sector?
Well, that's a good question. It's obviously a subjective question because in my opinion, it's never enough because I'm so, and this is sort of my bias speaking here, but I'm such a huge proponent and fan of the arts across all mediums. I think they're just so vitally important. And so the answer, in my opinion, is no. And I'll use a little bit of an anecdote here that I did mention this in the article, but it seems like a lot lately where, every artist I talk to has a friend or a collaborator or a bandmate or name it, and someone who packed up and moved away. And it seems to be Montreal is like where people seem to be going, which is a long ways away. But it's really unfortunate because what's happening is the vibrancy of the scene, for the reasons that Franz mentioned around inflation and costs and housing availability, and there's all these factors that are contributing to, and I think it's at huge risk. And I think it's one of those circumstances that could be a bit like a boiling frog. We don't realize that it's happening until it's too late, and then our vibrant art scene is a half of what it used to be, and we woke up one day and realized it all of a sudden, right? And so I think we need to do more. I think we need to make sure that our arts ecosystem is healthy, and I use the term ecosystem very deliberately because we have these world-class venues like the Royal Theatre, for example, but there's all these other venues that are sort of along the spectrum that are sort of the feeder system, if you will, of those sorts of like higher end performance venues. And those are the venues and the artists and the rehearsal space and the guilds, the places where you can get advice and be mentored by more senior or more experienced artists that can sort of help you hone your craft over time and become a better performer or a better actor or a better writer or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so all those things, all those aspects of the ecosystem need to be supported. And the last thing I'll say on that is I have this great example that I was sort of on this rant the other day about this, but people don't realize like how important an ecosystem is to an artist. And my favorite example, because it's such an example that everybody and their dog knows, is Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
So Taylor Swift, we all know, is a world-class, world-famous pop star, one of the most popular artists in the history of the music business. And an interesting anecdote about Taylor Swift is that although she did start performing at a young age, when she was 9 or 10 years old, in Philadelphia, where she's from, her parents would take her to New York City and she would get lessons and she would do performing and all that kind of stuff. And then when she was 11, she actually traveled with her family to Nashville, Tennessee. Back then, of course, she was much more of a aspiring country artist, right? So she went to Nashville, she recorded some demos and she handed these out to record labels and met with some agents and things like that. And she was actually rejected across the board from all of them.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's because that if you think about what Nashville is one of the most robust ecosystems in the world for music. And so if you go there, like you can go to a coffee shop and see one of the best, bassists that you've ever seen. And you'd be like, wow, this person's playing in a coffee shop. Well, it's because they're in this ecosystem that nurtures world-class talent across a number of different genres, not just country music, but a number of different genres. And so when Taylor went there when she was 11, she just didn't stand out enough from the crowd because there's just so much art going on in that genre in Nashville. And so what happened? Well, her parents, to their credit, recognized this. And when she was about 13, they moved the family to Nashville so that Taylor could be embedded and nurtured within this ecosystem. She could actually start writing her own music, which she did after she moved to Nashville. And being part of this ecosystem, you then start to hone your craft. You start to have to compete against other people who are quite good, and you have to rise above and hone and get rejected and try again and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of that, you have Taylor Swift, global icon.
Interesting.
And that's, I think, is the ecosystem is so vitally important, and that's what's at risk in our community right now.
Okay, that is interesting. Franz, what are your thoughts about that? The ecosystem that you work within and the threats to it?
Well, I completely agree with what Dallas just said, and I would say that some municipalities are very supportive of the arts and others are not. And I think the fact that the municipalities are so fragmented here, we have a population of less than maybe 400,000,
yeah,
and we have 13 municipalities. So some, like Victoria, for example, does invest significantly and notably in the arts in quite a number of ways. Other municipalities just don't. And it's like I've said, our operating budget is only about 10% is only about funded 10%. Yeah. That's way below what's industry average for a performing arts center, which is around the 40 to 50%, depending on what the service levels and the expectations are. I would say that what's really missing is low-cost rehearsal space, like low-cost rehearsal studios, like Dallas just said. It takes a lot of time to develop as an artist, and individual art projects, whether it's a song, an album, a play, a show, whatever, it takes a lot of time to create and practice and rehearse and so on. You can't do that in a high-cost performance venue. That has to be done in a low-cost rehearsal space where people have time to sort of be themselves and so on. And so, creating art takes time, and it has to be affordable. And so I think that's a huge missing piece that we have.
So it's not something we're necessarily losing so much as we never did have enough. Is that what you're saying, or?
Well, I would say that I heard recently, a while ago, kind of an interesting factoid that homelessness tends to be in North America highest where you have in the richest cities, right? So San Francisco and so on, because people can't afford to live in those cities. Other cities like Detroit, for example, counterintuitively have lower rates of homelessness. And I think it's the same with artists, right? Like artists who are on the ground, grassroots, and they're creating, they need access to space. And if that space is more profitably, understandably, used for some other purpose, where do they create their art.
Right.
Yeah, think about this. Like, think about the importance of the garage. Like,
Yeah.
we actually have a term in music called a garage band, right? It's because you're in your parents' garage or your neighbor, your drummer's garage. Usually your drummer, because I'm a drummer. So my bandmates were always at my house because it's hard, the drums are hardest to move. But if you think about what Franz is saying is that as the place gets more and more unaffordable, people convert their garage or their basement to a suite.
That's right.
And now you have a tenant in there, and then a tenant. I mean, as a drummer, again, I can't play drums in a place where there's tenants. It would just be people don't understand how loud drums are when you're practicing. And all the a band that's practicing is not a refined thing where all the music flows and from song to song to song. You're playing the same song sometimes 15, 20 times in a row, working out all the little kinks and getting the interlude right and all this kind of stuff. And it's not that pleasurable to listen to as a bystander.
No.
So you need that space to just rehearse and make mistakes and hone and stuff. And that takes, you wouldn't rent a studio for that because it would be way too expensive.
I lived next door to a tuba player once, and practicing was very interesting, I tried to be supportive of culture, but my goodness, yeah. So
what's that
obviously...
anecdote? It's the forget the name of the author, but it's the 10,000 hours thing.
Yes.
Can you imagine the first 8,000 of those? Like what that sounds like if you're a violin player or a tubist or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I'm also wondering if something else comes into play here. I mean, as a writer, and I think most artists would relate to this, there seems to be this prevailing sentiment that you do art because you love it, and that you put on performances because you love it. So money should not be a significant factor in there. And, I still hear that, oh, you're doing it for the love of it. So that somehow compensates for the fact that it's not being funded well or paid well.
Yeah.
How does that...
Well, maybe.
What are your thoughts on that?
I would also argue then, why didn't Michael Jordan play basketball for free if he loved it so much?
Good point, right?
Why doesn't Sidney Crosby play hockey for free?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's because the audience values the spectacle of sport, and it's become this big money game. And arts, for some reason, has not become that same level of game. I mean, with the exception of, Taylor Swift is breaking records right now.
Yes.
People are paying $10,000 for a ticket. People waiting in line. There was 2 million people in demand for the concerts that she had just recently announced in Toronto, right? And so, is Taylor doing it for free? No, she's making $12 million on average per night.
That's right.
On her tour, right? So, the answer is no. I don't think we should expect art or artists to work for free. Not to say there isn't a little bit of a competition thing going on. Like they should be, like if you think about. The other great ecosystem that I love to talk about is Vienna. So Vienna went through a Renaissance period where you had like all these world famous, for centuries, world famous artists like Mozart, and all living at the same time in the same place. And to me, is that a coincidence? Well, no, it isn't. It's because the ecosystem in Vienna was nurturing, and they had to compete with each other to get the best venues, and they wanted to get the best audiences and the best ticket prices or whatever. And so they would compete. And hone their craft to become the best of the best.
Yep.
But again, those were all honed by venues like coffee shops. The coffee culture in Vienna at the time was part of what factored into this, right?
Right.
But you had an artist like Beethoven that wasn't from Vienna, but ultimately moved to Vienna to be part of the ecosystem. So I guess that's sort of a workaround of your question, but I don't think the answer. I think arts deserves money.
Yes.
And I think a good example of a place that respects that is Iceland, because Iceland they have probably the most robust creative culture in the world by per capita for sure. They're only 250,000 people, but they have a program where artists can submit an application for it, and it's an income support program. So you can say, hey, I want to go and produce an album because I'm a musician, and I'm going to apply for an income support over X time that I can use to supplement my income or support my income, wholly, for the purpose of producing art. And I think that's an interesting one because it's the government doing it. It's really a reflection. The governments are in democracy is a reflection of societal values, and they obviously value it really highly, and so therefore they're willing to pay an artist a salary to produce art, which I think is amazing.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Franz?
Yeah,
you want to add?
I generally agree, but I have a slightly different take. I think it's really tricky to define who is an artist and who isn't. And I think a lot of effort in government policy and funding was spent in the 20th century to sort of try that. And I think it kind of collapsed. But I think that what is clear and what does work is government supporting the infrastructure of an ecosystem, right? So just like any other market or economy, if you want to an industry, a business, you need certain infrastructure like roads, sewers, bridges, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Which individual businesses thrive and make it and survive is beyond the ability of the government to determine. But same as in the arts, I think the infrastructure needs to be there needs to be an agreement, a common vision of the region of what that should be, and then the gaps in the infrastructure filled in so that there's a thriving community ecosystem and people have a chance of getting from, young, talented kid to established working professional because the essential components are there in the community.
Exactly. And I know, again, as a writer, who's familiar with the, Canada Council for the Arts, there's been so many arguments over the years because in some ways it allows artists to really, do projects that are very meaningful. And then critics will argue, well, it makes artists soft if they're not fighting tooth and nail for everything. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. There are good parts of it and not. But the entrepreneurial artist, well, they also need time to be able to sit and be creative, not just sell all the time. So it's a good point. Well, we really can't talk about the arts and culture sector, particularly here in North America, without discussing the impact of Richard Florida, whose concept, if our listeners will recall a few years ago, of the creative class emphasized the role of creative and knowledge-based workers in driving economic growth and urban development. His ideas revolved around the notion that creative individuals, including artists, tech professionals, and professionals in other innovation fields, contribute significantly to a region's economic success. So, Dallas, I'll start with you. How have Richard Florida's theories held up over time? How are they relevant to our region?
Yeah, I think there's two sort of overarching answers to this question. The first one is positive and the second one is negative.
Okay.
So start with the positive. I'm a big fan of Richard Florida. So Richard Florida basically was among the first, I'm going to say he wasn't the first, but he was among the first to point out the changing role of talent in the economy and how knowledge work is really about human ingenuity. So you're using your brain rather than your hands to produce an economic product or outcome. And so that shift occurred sort of to the latter end of the Industrial Revolution. And that's really, if you think about how the economy works now, we've evolved to this sort of knowledge economy, service economy, where the vast majority of economic output is from ideas and ingenuity. So that's what Florida was, theorizing around. And he wrote, and he said, like, okay, well, if you want to drive your economy, you should track this creative class, this percentage of the workforce at the time was about 30% of the total. And he said, if you want to create a vibrant, community economy, you should attract those people to your community, and they'll create the type of atmosphere that'll build vibrant architecture, and they'll support the arts and blah, blah, blah. Right. Yep. So that all actually is true. And in fact, it was so true that people, his prediction was that, these younger creative workers would flock to cities, especially larger cities, and those cities would be better for it, right? And that's what happened in the early 21st century. Is people flocked away. They left Omaha and they went to Denver. They left the Midwest and they went to San Francisco and San Diego and LA and all these fabulous cities that we all know, right? Well, the negative side of this now is that this has become these cities are almost a victim of their own success, if you will. Is that they become superstars at attracting talent across certain segments of the economy, but some of them left out what I would argue in the conversation we're having today is like, Florida is talking about the creative human ingenuity side of the economy, whereas arts are not, like we talked about this already, right? They're not make art for the purpose of
No.
becoming wealthy. Most people don't. You certainly can make art to become wealthy,
Yes.
but most people do it because it's passion and it's it's sort of something driving you. You're like this creative force, and I think it's the most, to me, it's the most high. It's one of the most highest calling you can have as a human is to create, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, what's happened is you have this whole gentrification thing going on now where cities have become so expensive that it's actually, like I said, they're victims of their own success because now you have artists and musicians and all these sort of, there's service class workers across the board that aren't artists, but they're all being driven out or driven to the point of this breaking point where they can't afford to live in these cities. And so Richard Florida has now actually, he reversed himself in recent article where he's quoted as saying, when a place becomes boring, even the rich people leave. So that's a quote that he made in an article about San Francisco.
Yeah.
Where San Francisco, it was the beacon of creativity and this weird, this whole like bohemian culture and like weirdos, and San Francisco is just known for that, right? But now when you think, the first thing that comes to your mind in San Francisco is like, the tech worker, the tech bro in the coffee shop that's, talking about changing the world by inventing some tech that won't ultimately change the world, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, because when a place becomes vibrant and artistic and, culturally vibrant, it's not just artists that are attracted to move there. It's, the tech workers, it's people who have the money, who want to relocate businesses, all of that stuff, right? It's a beacon, and we strive for that, but we end up, What was the old, there was the old Eagles song, when you call someplace paradise, kiss it goodbye. So we have to be careful. What are your thoughts on maybe not Florida so much as just this whole, movement to become artistic beacons for urban culture and the impact on cities? Franz?
Well, I completely agree with Dallas. When I was working in Silicon Valley 4 years ago, one thing I heard was, smart people don't want to work in boring places, and that probably comes from Florida, could be. And I think that's obviously been proven out and has worked its way through. But I think, also as Dallas noted at the beginning of the interview, the arts is, it's significantly about economics, but it's mostly about human experience and sharing that human experience. And, even me working in arts infrastructure, if you will, when I've had a long day of, leaning into a spreadsheet and my eyes have glazed over, or I've been beaten up in a bunch of meetings or whatever, and then I take a break and go to a performance. Sometimes that is a reminder emotionally of why we do things, or there's some poignant song or moment in a performance where some kind of aspect of human endeavor or relationship or whatever it is being communicated in a funny way or a tender way or a impactful way, and you kind of reset. And it's like watching your kids at a struggle to hit a puck with a hockey stick when they're not quite there. All of those human moments are, you remind yourself, oh yeah, that's why we do what we do. And then you're sharing it with other people in a theater, for example. Yeah. Or a coffee shop or whatever it is. But you're experiencing that sort of profound humanness, and then you're sharing it with other people. So that is what not everyone agrees with me, but I believe that arts and sport are very similar in the sense that it's these shared experiences that continue to motivate us and inspire us. And you can learn lots of great lessons from art and sport, and sometimes there's bad things that are taught instead, like competition is everything. But I think generally these are some of the things that we live for. We save our hard-earned money to go and have a wonderful experience and share that with other people.
You know,
Love that.
I think that's so true. I remember actually coming to the Royal Theatre. It was probably 2022. I'm not sure. I can't remember when everything started again, but it was one of the first performances, and it was Dance Victoria, something sponsored through there, and actually feeling like this well of emotion, being in a crowd, experiencing this. Like, it was unexpected, but the pandemic had deprived us of that.
Yep.
Really crucial kind of human experience. So it was a good reminder, you know, that how much we need that and how much the arts and culture bond us. And I mean, you talked about that in your article, like, you know, arts and culture, like helping with grief or addiction or all kinds of things. So let's talk a little more about some of the non-tangible assets, you know, of arts and culture.
Well, I think the first thing I would say to that is, like, if you think about the, you know, where humans and civilization came from, and like arts has been playing a role in that for thousands of years. And the one thing that's true of every culture out in the world, and they all evolved in isolation, was the role that arts plays in all of them, and in all of them. There's no exceptions that I'm aware of where it hasn't played a role. And so it's this, like, you know, the human condition, the expression of human condition, and that's it's sort of the underlying, and that's why I opened the comment was, oh, the economic contribution of the arts is big. Yeah,
yes.
I'm trying to surprise you with that, but that's not the reason why that arts is so important.
No.
But it is an interesting, you know, bullet point in the list of reasons. But yeah, I think the intangible stuff. And the CRD report, actually, that I referenced, where a lot of this data came from, they talk a lot about some of the programs that they support, and through municipal governments, of course. But some of the things that they're supporting around, like, addictions and the use of you know, music therapy, and, you know, there's all these different less understood or less realized aspects of art that play a role in all these things, grief counseling and all the rest. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what about you, Franz, the non-tangibles? You've talked about some of that, the human experience. Are there other things that we need to look for, the non-tangible benefits, I guess, the beyond the economic and the size of audiences and all that?
Yeah, I think I would, again, come back to, you know, what Dallas was talking about. I mean, you have to imagine human beings in hundreds of thousands of years ago, in simpler times, you know, gathering around a fire at night, telling a story about the day's activity, or, you know, doing shadow puppets or whatever, that shadow plays, that kind of thing, or songs, or you know, rhythmic chants to make working easier. There's all kinds of really deep-rooted sources of why art is important, and it also allows us to tell stories in our modern era. So, you know, it was interesting that you know, the sort of canon of songs and music and whatever that I grew up with references sort of my age and era and so on and so forth. But maybe a year ago, I heard some song, I think, on the CBC radio, and they referenced some kind of COVID experience, and I thought, oh wow, this is you know, the modern era being reflected and communicated and put out there for people to experience and feel and think about it, and it's part of the ongoing exchange and zeitgeist and whatever you want to call it of being a human being. A lot of stuff gets worked out and built up and torn down through the arts. You think of all the, you know, if you're out driving around the island and you hear what someone's blasting through their pickup truck or their Tesla, you know, you get a sense of what their values are and the story they're trying to tell, right?
That's right.
So
it's right.
Becomes part of the whole, just, you know.
Can I add one thing to that?
So, of course, yeah.
This is one thing that's playing out right now. You see it online and social media and all these things, is sort of this movement of defunding the CBC.
Yes.
So I just want to address the how important, like when we talk about art and cultural expression and all these things, the importance of place in this is actually, I think, really interesting. So this movement of defunding the CBC, what they're saying is like, who cares about Canadian content when, we're right next to America, the cultural epicenter of the world, and they're producing more content than we could ever consume. So why would we care about Canadian content anyways, right?
Yep.
And I just wholeheartedly disagree with this. Like, I think Canada, like the fact that we are right next door to the United States, the largest economy in the history of the world, it makes it more important to have our Canadian values and our Canadian culture expressed through art.
Agreed.
And that's, one guy, I saw this American, he was on this investigative path of like, why the Tragically Hip are so popular in Canada. And he was trying to investigate, like, what is it about this music that Canadians are so passionate about? And so he's trying to like discover it and couldn't quite hit the nail on the head. But one thing about the Tragically Hip's music is that the lyrical content is uniquely Canadian. So there's reference points in many, many, many songs that they put out over the years that refer to Canadian places, Canadian, even like crime stories and things that happened in Canada. And it's a story, if you follow the history of it, it's a story of Canadian. It's uniquely Canadian. And that sort of thing would be less likely if you didn't have supportive programs like you mentioned, the Canadian government programs that support Canadian artists, but also CBC as a venue that sort of amplifies Canadian content.
Well, that's kind of echoed in, Canadian publishing. I mean, it's a hard slog for Canadian novelists and poets and short story writers. I mean, because they're just dwarfed by America, but it's really important for people like, like we all know Leonard Cohen. I mean, think about what that is for our national identity. When Leonard Cohen sings something, we feel so Canadian. Or when the Tragically Hip plays, or look at the outpouring. I mean, even we're going back a few years, look at Gordon Lightfoot. Who knew? But people suddenly remembered him. And then, of course, there's new bands coming up and great new artists. So I agree, those stories are important to keep, and they're embedded in they need to be embedded in, our institutions and our culture.
Well, they're our stories to tell.
Yes.
And so they should be told and heard.
And so Victoria's story, Greater Victoria's story, we have stories to tell coming out of here. And, like I hear local bands or poets, and I love that. But I have to tell you, the other night I went to this Vivaldi concert by candlelight at what's it called? Fort Commons. And so along with this beautiful Four Seasons playing, we had a very unique local performer, a seagull. And it was so West Coast. Here's this Italian meets West Coast, but it was beautiful. And it was gathering, I guess we're coming to the end of our time, and I guess I want to ask you, Dallas, what haven't we talked about that's really important to you? What are some of your final thoughts around this?
Yeah, well, I think to me it goes down to the call to action. So what do we want people to do? So anyone's listening to this, and maybe you're a longtime patron of the arts, or you're a big supporter, you're doing everything you can, or maybe you're sort of a casual listener or whatever. But I think there's things that we can all do to support the arts. I mean, the simple thing would be to go and see a live show, or go buy an art piece from an artist at a gallery. You can go to an open house at Rockslide Gallery, for example, and you can meet I think there's 80 artists that are in there, and they have open house, and you can literally buy art from artists. So that's a simple thing. I mean, it's obviously less attainable the more expensive the art gets, but there's easy way to buy a postcard or a print or something that's inexpensive as a gift or whatever. So that's a low level. But I think at a higher level, I think to me it all comes down to making sure that we're creating this vibrant ecosystem, and the biggest threat to the ecosystem right now is affordability. And so I believe this is a little bit of bias here, but I think we need to build more diverse types of housing in every neighborhood in the region. Every neighborhood in the region deserves to have a range of housing types, so that all these types of people, from service class to the wealthy oceanfront mansion, I guess, but everything in between, right? We need diverse forms of housing that make our region more accessible, and we can attract more types of occupations. We can attract more types of people, and making sure that we're embedding that into our society, because it's to me, it's at risk.
Okay, I mean, yeah, really important. What about you, Franz? Have we missed talking about anything that's really core for you, or is there anything you'd like to add to the discussion?
I'll just put in my plug again for really supporting and advancing the idea of affordable rehearsal studio space. I think something needs to happen there. Yes, there needs to be affordable housing for people. Absolutely, people need space they can afford to create their art and get it ready to perform. You know, at the Royal and the Mac, we can host a show once something is a show, but until it gets to the point where it's a show, it needs to be created in a lower cost environment, and we need that. There are a lot of gaps there.
Is there any initiatives at foot that you're aware of to?
There are, some organizations. I think a lot of organizations sort of do their own thing, like Pacific Upper Victoria. They have the Bauman Center, which is essentially a renovated gymnasium on the back of a church, which works really well for them. But, they're a very sophisticated, established organization, and not every one can do that. And so I would, encourage something like artists coming together, maybe like a member cooperative or an artist collective or something, where people say, we're competing, but we also have common needs, kind of a syndication model where people can maybe secure a larger space, renovate it, and share the various aspects of those resources, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good point. And I want to ask you, I'd be remiss not to ask you what you're excited about for the Royal and McPherson theaters coming up this fall. What's happening? What are some of the highlights? What are you guys doing?
Well, Saturday we have Bonnie Raitt coming, and that's going to be an amazing show that will give us all something to talk about, if you pardon the terrible pun there on one of the most famous songs.
I love that.
And we have the comedian Lewis Black coming up in a few weeks. He's awesome. We have an illusionist coming up at the Royal. We have Manhattan Transfer, which a lot of people recognize. And the Victoria Symphony is starting up with a sort of a science fiction-based Star Wars and Star Trek and Beyond show. And we have Pacific Upper Victoria early October doing performance of Die Valkyrie, which is one of Richard Wagner's huge blockbuster 5-hour marathon operas. So it's really sort of pushing what the Royal can do in the same way that Come From Away did back in May. So big and bold and small and intimate and lots in between.
Absolutely. And I want to give a shout out. Dallas mentioned the Rock Slide Gallery. I want to mention the Rock Bay Square, which is a building that I guess could have been developed in many ways, but for many years a local family made that space affordable to local artists. And, main floor, ice cream shop, coffee shop, but upstairs little artist studios, and it's played a key role for some of our, I guess, most known artists in the city. So we need more of that. So I think we need people to support the arts. Come forward. If you have space, if you can afford to subsidize that for artists, do it. And and where can people find out more? What's your website, Franz?
rmts.bc.ca.
Okay, and Dallas from South Island Prosperity, your website. People want to know more about economic development?
Well, southislandprosperity.ca, or they can check out the article on douglasmagazine.ca as well.
Yeah, douglasmagazine.com.
Sorry.
And it's the economic lens, and Dallas has the column monthly on great topics, and we'll be talking to you again. So as we wrap up today's episode, it's evident arts and culture is not just a nice pastime, but it's essential to a city's vitality and also economic growth. So the next time you stroll through the art gallery, attend a local theater production, or visit a cultural festival, remember, you're not just enjoying the experience, you're contributing to your city's vibrancy and economy. I want to thank Franz Lehrbass and Dallas Gislason for your insights, and thank you to our listeners. Tune in to the Rising Economy podcast on Check's Podcast Network or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts, including Spotify. Finally, our Rising Economy podcasts are an important way of keeping conversations about our economy going all year round, leading up to our 4th annual Rising Economy Conference, March 6th to 8th, here in Victoria. Find out more at ourrisingeconomy.ca. Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership. Learn more at southislandprosperity.ca.